going to turn things over to Ben, who has been doing work for years on Jackson Purchase connections to Major League Baseball players and baseball as a part of American culture. And when we started talking about this, I was reminded of Jacques Barzun's famous quote, "If you want to understand America, you must learn baseball." And I'm going to turn things over now to my friend, Ben.
Hello, everyone, and everyone from Zoom land. I am Ben Moss, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. When Dr. Mulligan asked me to speak, I was sort of at a loss because I don't have any books or articles or a doctorate or anything like that, just a normal middle school social studies teacher, but I do love baseball. I always have loved baseball, and I love the history of baseball specifically. If I had to choose an era or time that I liked the most, I'd say it's in the 1920s to 1940s in baseball. So that's right up my alley, especially the Cardinals in the 30s is my kind of thing. When he asked me to do a certain presentation of Jackson Purchase players, I honestly didn't know a whole lot about them. Besides the active players that had played during my lifetime, I knew them, and I knew some of them, and I've met some of them and seen their games, and sort of just was enamored with a lot of them. But when I dug into the research of it, I found so much more with the history of the Jackson Purchase in baseball, specifically the history of baseball and players that played in the major leagues, which you probably never heard of before, these players. They're sort of lost in history. A lot of these players had what people would call a cup of coffee in the major leagues, which means they weren't there very long, but they were there, and they spent a lot of their time in the minors. I did not do any minor league players. We have quite a number of minor league baseball players from the Jackson Purchase, but I just sort of concentrated on the major league players. So I just wanted to start with this quote. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie The Field of Dreams, but there's a quote there that I think that really resonates. It says, "The one constant thing through the years, Ray, has been baseball. America has rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. But baseball has marked the time. This field, this game, it's a part of our past, Ray. It reminds us of all that once was good and could be again." I thought that's just a very impactful thing. And so, to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been a baseball fan my whole life. As I said, it's in my blood. A funny story about my family and baseball. So my great-grandfather owned a grocery store, which was, if you're familiar with McNabb Elementary School in Paducah, it is not towards downtown Paducah. That's where I went to elementary school. But anyway, his little grocery store was across the street where McNabb is now. It's a Plaza Tire now, I think, or something. But he was a big Cardinal fan. My whole family, just big Cardinal fans on my dad's side. My mom's side, more Tigers fans. But the Cardinal were out for sure. So my dad told me a story about he only heard my grandfather, I guess it would be my great-grandfather, curse once in his life. Only heard him curse once. And that's when the Cardinals traded Wally Moon, who was Rookie of the Year in 1955, for the Cardinals to the Los Angeles Dodgers. And the passion of their was definitely shown with the out loud cursing. So ironically, Wally Moon passed away about 5 years ago. And so one of the things I got into, especially in the early 2000s, was writing older players and just sending them a card or something and just sort of reaching out to them. So I told Mr. Moon about this story, and he enjoyed that story, so he signed my card, "Sorry to make your grandfather curse Wally Moon." And he wrote me a little letter, and he says, whenever that happened, I actually cursed as well, because he definitely enjoyed, I guess, being a Cardinal, but it's just an interesting story. So my hobby is really researching baseball, but I like to collect old autographs of baseball players, especially, as I said, 20s, 30s, and 40s. The story, the uniqueness of it is something that I really enjoy. I collect mostly vintage stuff. I spend way too much time on it. I spend too much money on it. But it's definitely a way of historically preserving things. And it's sort of like my version of being Indiana Jones and looking for that rare artifact, especially when it comes to Cardinal folklore and Cardinal history. So the search for the artifact is what's always gotten me. My dad started me, who's here today, started me into this whenever I was really young, and we sort of grew in it together. We enjoyed it together, and sort of took off. After that, I had a good friend who taught at Paducah Middle School a long time, Ronnie Sandifer. He also sort of pushed me towards that way too, and I've been crazy about it ever since. Now down to business. I'd like to talk to you about some Jackson Purchase members and surrounding areas that were born and buried in this area. I was absolutely amazed at the information that I found. Who knew that so many baseball players are from this area? As I said earlier, I concentrated mostly for major league players. I also spent a lot of research on most of it all on deceased players from the 1920s and 1930s, which is sort of right up my alley. So let's start with Ed Hawley. Ed Hawley was a Major League Baseball player that was from Benton, Kentucky. There you go. And he's buried in Paducah at Mount Carmel Cemetery. I have some artifacts of Mr. Hawley back there, if you want to see those. It's a Butterfinger 1932 jumbo card and a 34 Gowdy card, which if everybody needs to put their name in the little box there, I'm going to be giving away that 34 Gowdy card today if you're lucky to put your name in there.
There'll be time to get into drawing.
Yeah.
Yes. And I have a signed one as well from 34 Gowdy back there with the authentication. So Hawley spent most of his minor league years in Louisville, and he had a Hall of Fame manager, as in Joe McCarthy, and he played with Earl Combs, who was a Yankee Hall of Famer center fielder from the 27 Yankees, which is Murderer's Row, if you've ever heard of that, if you're not familiar with the Sandlot movie. I played with him as well. He made his major league debut for the Chicago Cubs, unfortunately, in 1928. He made 13 appearances in relief and had a respectable 3.77 ERA. So a cup of coffee and 28. But he was sent down in 29 and to 31 until he was called up by the Philadelphia Phillies in 1932. So I'm assuming the Phillies purchased him, which was not uncommon at all back then. So in 1932, he became the Phillies' ace in a lot of ways. Now, saying that, the Phillies weren't very good. Okay, they weren't very good at all. Matter of fact, they were like one of the last. They were at the bottom of the standings. But nevertheless, he was their ace during that time. He won 11 games in 1932 and 13 in 1933. He was a top 10 pitcher in regards to WAR. WAR is a baseball term that means wins above replacements, meaning that whenever he's in the game, he's going to help you percentage-wise to win that game. Okay, so it's a pretty big deal. During the 34th season, he was released. I don't know why he was released. I know that he did have a problem with alcoholism. I reached out to a family member of his, and he told me some stories about how that he really ostracized his family got into drinking, and that could be a reason. I couldn't find any reasons why, besides he just didn't have a very good year that year for the Phillies. He was picked up by the Pirates, and that's when sort of the wheels fell off. He went 1-8 for the Pirates that year, and he was released. And that was pretty much it for Mr. Hawley. He did have children. He didn't have much to do with those children, unfortunately. He moved back to Paducah towards the end of his life. He spent most of his life in and around Philadelphia area, obviously. Another interesting note about Mr. Hawley is that I looked at a lot of censuses that doing a lot of research on these players. You look and see like, hey, are there family members that are still alive? Can I reach out to them? So any information about these people? And every census he had, he never put he was a baseball player. Every other player I saw put that he was a baseball player. But in this one, hey, how are you? He never put he was a baseball player, which I thought was pretty unique and ironic. If you really want to know more about him, there's an excellent article on in the Marshall County Trib by actually one of his family members about him. If you have a chance, I suggest to read about it. He's buried in the Mount Carmel Cemetery, if you know where that's at, Paducah. It's a hard grave to find. I went out there one day. I don't know, it's probably October when I couldn't find it. So I just went to find a grave to sort of look it up. I do have a video, though, I want to show of him. It's from 1931. Connie Mack, who was a Hall of Fame manager and managed the Philadelphia Athletics and had some wonderful teams there in Philadelphia. He had to sell a lot of them off because he didn't make much money. But all right, our next individual here is Mel Butch Simons. Now, I got the privilege to actually talk to his grandson through research and through censuses and whatnot. I got his phone number and through the magic of Facebook and actually got to talk to him. Very, very nice gentleman. So he played for the Chicago White Sox in 1931, played 68 games and then 7 games in 1932. He had he didn't have a lot of success in the majors, but he did bat over 300 in the minors. And what people have to understand is back in the 30s, there was not a whole lot of teams, especially in the major leagues. So to be in the major leagues for a long period of time was a big deal because you had to be really good. So, that's why there were so many local barnstorming teams that would come around. And I'll talk more about that later. He had a limit. He limited him out in the 30s. It was, as I said, it was much harder to play in the majors. He played in the Kitty League for a while. He coached in the Kitty League for the Paducah Indians in 1941. And he coached in Quebec, in Canada. And 42 was his last year as a player manager. And actually back there I have his contract that he signed in 42 with Quebec. And it's nice because by reaching out to his grandson, we made some connections there, and we'll get him that contract to him and his family. He's buried in Fulton, Kentucky. Okay, so Mr. Simons, somebody you probably never heard of before as well. I asked his grandson, can you tell me anything about his playing days and whatnot? He opened up an electrical store after his playing time. It says he loved baseball, he loved talking about baseball, but not a whole lot about his major league time. His wife, one player his wife didn't like was Babe Ruth because he was just so arrogant, but I've never heard that before, so I thought that was ironic. So a lot of these players we're going to come up to literally had such a small baseball career that no one probably had ever heard of. Pat McGehee is buried in Paducah. He pitched 1 game for the Detroit Tigers in 1912.
He is related to him.
Oh, really?
He's my great-great-grandfather.
There you go. He started 1 game, he gave up a hit and a walk, and he was taken out, and he never pitched again. That was it. All she wrote. He was a World War I veteran, and the 20th Engineers, a very important part of the military. I did some research on that. They played a major role in a lot of American wars. From what I understand, from my research, it looks like what brought him to Paducah was working for the railroads. So he came to Paducah, worked for the railroads, and he is buried in Maple Lawn Cemetery. So, not a whole lot about that. Couldn't find any more really about him besides just probably came for the railroad. Dixie Carroll. Dixie Carroll is more of a legend in something called the PCL, the Pacific Coast League, which was a league that a lot of former players went to after their major league careers, and a lot of emerging stars came from. Joe DiMaggio played in the Pacific Coast League. But there's a card back there from the 1920s of Dixie Carroll. He played for the Los Angeles Angels, and this is before the Angels were actually a major league team. This is when they were part of the Pacific Coast League. A lot of the teams out west started off as Pacific Coast League teams, and then over time, the names sort of carried over into major leagues. So he played 15 games for the Boston Braves in 1919, 49 plate appearances and 13 hits. He also started an electrical business. He stayed in Florida. He played a while in Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida. So he played there and is buried there as well. And this is one of my favorite ones, Buster Ross. Any Mayfield people here? So he's sort of the pride of Mayfield, even though I would venture to say most people from Mayfield don't know who he is. So he played for the Red Sox in 24 through 26, and he went to Mayfield High School, so for 3 years. Did well 24, downhill in 25 and 26. He played for the Kitty League, the Mayfield Pants Makers. A lot of these guys played for a lot of these the Kitty League teams. By the way, if you ever have a chance to go to see a lot of these, the college league this summer, it's the Ohio Valley League. The Paducah Chiefs are there, the Hoptown Hoppers. A lot of these names are actually Kitty League names. So they just sort of took over. He gave up Babe Ruth's 300th home run, which I thought was unique. There's an article about it there I found. He holds a Major League record for committing 4 errors by a pitcher in 1 inning, which I don't know how that's possible, but he holds that record along with some other people, but he does hold that record, so that may be the reason why he didn't stay in the majors that long. He is buried at Maplewood Cemetery in Mayfield, who knew that somebody from our region would hold a major league record. Some other things that I learned about him. After his career, he came back here and he was a truck driver for a while, and he was also a wholesaler at a tobacco warehouse. So he still, from what I understand, has family in Mayfield, and I couldn't really find them, but from what I understand, he does. So maybe one day I can talk to him. All right, a couple of Negro League players. Okay. James Fields from Hopkinsville. I know that's not necessarily the Jackson Purchase, but hey, I figured, why not? He played for the St. Louis Giants in 1921. It's a Negro League team who eventually in 1922 became the St. Louis Stars. And the St. Louis Stars is going to be a team that's going to have many future Hall of Famers in it. From if you've ever been to Busch Stadium with the statues out in front of it, there's a guy named Cool Papa Bell who played for the St. Louis Stars in 1922. He only played 1 season, 2 wins, 3 losses. There's no record of his death. There's no record of his grave. He did play that season with one of the most influential Negro League players and one of the most influential players in history named Oscar Charleston. But he was a packer of tobacco after his career, worked in the flour mill. I'm assuming would guess he might have hurt his arm, or it just might not have been good enough. And that was it. It's been unique how often I've found how a lot of these players just would play one season, and then after that, they call it quits and stop. Lonnie Torian, born literally a couple of miles from my house in Massac, Kentucky. If you're familiar where Massac Creek is in Paducah, around that area. Played one game for the St. Louis Giants. Worked for the TVA afterward, was a junk dealer, served in World War I. From what I understand, he was in a unit that previously were the Buffalo Soldiers, if you've ever heard of the Buffalo Soldiers. But during World War I, he spent a lot of his time in the Philippines. Not a lot about him. More than likely, and this was very common, if players, these players would play in these local teams. And if a scout would come and watch these, and they would sign them and give them a chance to show what they were worth in the major leagues. And if they didn't cut it, they just let them go. Took a train back home, and that was it. And this is probably what happened to Lonnie Torian. Back in the 30s, and especially during the time, the Negro League days, I mean, they would play a doubleheader in the morning, drive 50 miles and play a doubleheader somewhere else, and then they do it the next day, over and over and over again. So you can only imagine how stressful that was, and how many players they cycle through. And I'm sure Mr. Torian is one of them. Vern Curtis. Turk is nickname for turkey. I found out about that. Who would have known that Bardwell, Kentucky would have a couple of players there? We'll get to those here in a minute. He lived in Bardwell. He was born in Cairo. He played for the Washington Senators in 43 and 44 and then 46. They were not very good, but nevertheless, he was there. There's a newspaper clipping back there of him. If you want to check him out, he didn't play very long. Most of his playing days were spent in the minors. He played a lot of his time in the minors in Minneapolis and then Chattanooga. Couldn't find much information about Turk as far as his jobs after baseball or much about him. I know that he did serve in World War II, and he is buried in Bardwell. So, who would have thought? Earl Grace, player that actually, there are 3 cards of him back there. So he was somebody that played 8 seasons in the major leagues. A backup catcher, had a lot of time. He was from Barlow, born in Barlow. But he didn't spend a crazy amount of time in Barlow. His dad was a real estate broker, so a farming real estate broker. And so you can only assume that he was selling or dealing with farmland in Barlow. And then he moved to Arizona. Well, from what I got in my research, same thing. Farmland, selling farmland. Like I said, mostly a backup catcher. And he played for the Chicago Cubs, and this is when Dizzy Dean, after his days with the Cardinals, and he hurt his toe and sort of derailed his career, and then this toe led to an arm injury, and he ended up with the Cubs. But him and Mr. Grace were big buddies. They were hunting buddies together, I read. After his career was over, he worked for as a scout. He owned citrus fields, and something pretty cool, sort of like the Jackson Purchase Historical Society in some ways. He would have these big reunions where players, and a lot of former players would move to Arizona for the weather. And he would have these big reunions of these former baseball players together, and sort of had a society that he kept together. So I thought that was sort of cool that he did that. And like I said, there are a few of his cards back there, a couple of Gaudis and something called Batter Up, which is a card from the 30s that literally you could stand up, and it was like a punch hole thing. You could stand it up. So pretty neat. I think if I had to choose one person but I enjoyed the most researching it would be Eddie Moore. And it was sort of ironic that I just came across him just by happenstance when I was doing my research. He was from Barlow, Kentucky. His dad died when he was young. His mom remarried a Norwegian immigrant, and they eventually moved to Louisiana. But he was a 1925 World Series champ with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He led off for that team in the 1925 season. So if you go look up the 1925 Pittsburgh Pirates, he was their leadoff guy. Played 7 games in the World Series, and offensively he played very well. He was the last major league hitter to have a bounce home run. So it used to be, now if it hits the ground and goes into the stands, it's a ground rule double, right? You automatically get a double. You go to second base, right? Well, before, in the 30s, if it bounced and went into the stands, it was a home run. If it bounced, so he was the last batter in history to have that. So the story about how he sort of got from the Pirates, got moved from the Pirates, is an interesting one. Let me reverse that for a minute and go back. So there's a Hall of Famer by the name of Pie Traynor. Okay, there was a lot of nicknames on the 25 World Series team for the Pirates. But Pie was not his real name, obviously, but that was his nickname. Pie Traynor, who went on to a Hall of Fame career, nearly lost his third base position to Eddie Moore. Matter of fact, Mr. Moore was outperforming him very well, but as it happens in baseball, Eddie Moore got hurt. Pie Traynor started taking off, and that was history. Traynor goes on to a Hall of Fame career. Eddie Moore ends up making his manager, Earl Clark, another Hall of Famer, mad. Fred Clark, excuse me. So the story is that he makes an error in a game. Mr. Moore had a nervous tick. Okay? Whenever he had a lot of stress on him or he was upset with himself, he smiled. He looked down and he smiled. Okay? Well, Clark saw that as he's loafing, he doesn't care, and it made him angry. And because of that, they traded him. They got rid of him. And I mean, I feel sorry for the guy in a lot of ways because it was just calming the nervous tick he had. And that was it. That's all she wrote. But he did have career past the Pirates. He played with the Boston Braves, Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Giants, Cleveland Indians. So he did have a long career. He was traded in 1931 for a rookie catcher named Ernie Lombardi, who was a Hall of Famer to the Brooklyn Dodgers. So that's what brought Ernie Lombardi to the majors, was Eddie Moore. So he after retirement, he became a farmer. He managed the Paducah Indians in 1937. He got the flu during a flu pandemic and never really recovered from it. He constantly had problems with flu-like symptoms the rest of his life. And he died at the age of 48. And he is buried in Lafayette, Kentucky. I put the grave as unknown, but I did find further research that he's actually buried in Lafayette. So. Another cup of coffee guy, Scotty Slayback. The only picture I've ever done of him is on Baseball Reference. Born in Paducah and moved to Indiana in 1926, played 2 games for the New York Giants. 8 at-bats, no walks, no hits, no runs. And that was all she wrote. Bounced around the minors for 9 seasons, so he played quite a bit, and he was a World War II vet as well. Not a whole lot I could find on him besides this. Irv Brame played for the Hopkinsville Hoppers from Hopkinsville, not Jackson Purchase once again, but still. He's another one that struggled with the flu a lot of his life. This was an interesting story about him. He during the Depression, a lot of players would go to these local teams because they paid more than the major league teams. They were like rent-a-player kind of guys. They would go literally hop from town to town. Well, he got caught doing this by Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was the commissioner of baseball at that time. I'm sure some of you have heard of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He was the one that, in the 1919 Black Sox scandal, banned Julius Joe Jackson and a lot of those players. Well, because of the stigma after the 1919 season, Landis was pretty tough on things. So he actually banned Irv for 2 seasons because of this, because he was breaking contracts and hopping around. Thought that was interesting. Played for the Pirates from 28 to 32. You've heard the Pirates a lot in this talk. We're going to come back to that here in a minute. Why? 1930 had 22 complete games. See, back in the 1930s, there really weren't many relief pitchers. You either stayed in and stunk it up, or you got finished. You finished. So, I would venture to say in one major league season nowadays, you might not have 15 complete games nowadays, maybe. And it's so rare nowadays. 22 complete games. He was top 10 in the major leagues in wins in 1929 and 1930. He was a good hitter as a pitcher. Never batted below .330 as a pitcher. It's pretty impressive. Became a farmer in Hopkinsville after his retirement. Some of the teams he beat, I was just doing research. He beat some of the Gas House gang, which was sort of like my thing I liked the most, and also helped manage the Indians in the 30s as well, the Paducah Indians. Okay, a lot of 37, from what I recall, was also a season that Eddie Moore might have managed as well. So a lot of the times the manager would get fired and another one would hop in. So he, Hawk Taylor, I'm sure many of you have heard of Hawk Taylor. Played from 57 to 70, Milwaukee Braves, New York Mets, California Angels, Kansas City Royals. Mostly as a backup catcher. He was from Metropolis, and then he's buried actually in Paducah. He caught and got one at bat in the 1957 Milwaukee Braves, so even though he wasn't on the World Series roster, the Braves did win the World Series that year, so technically he played on the World Series team. He didn't get a ring or anything like that, but still, he was on the team. Coached at Murray State, coached at PCC. Thought it was interesting. He got his nickname from a cereal he liked, Hawk of the Wilderness. Never heard of it? That's where he got it. He was a good basketball player too, got an offer from the University of Illinois. And he died in Paducah not too long ago, actually. I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of him and whatnot. Last one is an unfortunate one, Daniel Webb. Daniel's uncle and me taught together for a good while. Greg Webb was his uncle, and he was a principal at Heath for a long time. And Daniel went to Heath as well. He pitched for the White Sox from 2013 to 2016. 2014, he has 57 appearances. There are some clips on YouTube of him pitching if you want to look those up. And then in 2017, he died in an ATV accident on his farm. I will never forget the day that he died because his uncle was not at school, obviously, that day. And then he came back and it was just really sad. He was going to a tryout for the Washington Nationals, not too in the future. Before.
Wedding.
Were you?
That was their wedding reception.
What's that?
Accident happened.
Oh, was that? I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
it was terrible.
Yeah, it's a bad situation. Just sad overall. Here are some still living players from the area. Joe Hall, who managed the Paducah Chiefs for a good while. Phil Roof, I know probably a lot of you heard of Phil Roof, and Phil's still around Paducah. I see Phil around town. Matter of fact, I saw him not too long ago at the hardware store. Gene Roof, Gene's kids. I had Gene's daughter in school. he's around Paducah some, but he worked for the Tigers for a very long time as an instructor. Terry Shumpert played for Paducah Tillman. Mike Broadway, who two of my best friends played Little League with here, and he played for the Chicago White Sox. I ran into him, I would say 7 years ago at the gym. He's a really nice guy. Steve Finley, probably the most well-known player from this area. One of my favorite Major League players of all time. I got a big jersey of his in my house and stuff. He doesn't come around a whole lot. His mom now lives in Colorado, or at least wherever he is. I know that for a while he's been working in Major League Baseball as an instructor for these little camps for kids in Brazil, which I thought was pretty cool. And his dad still lives here. Howard Finley still lives around here, and you can see Howard. He's everywhere. Josh Stewart had his son in school, played for the Chicago White Sox. He's from Livingston County. Injury to his arm derailed him. He works at Western Baptist now. Really nice guy. Pat Osborne, I don't know a lot about him, from Murray. Played for the Reds and the Brewers. Do you know anything about him? You ever heard of him? And then, of course, Eddie Haas. Eddie Haas, very successful career. Didn't play a lot in the majors, but he managed the Braves. I believe 85 is when he managed the Braves. And really nice guy. So I want to talk a second about Barney Dreyfuss. Barney Dreyfuss is the founder of the World Series. Okay. Barney Dreyfuss spent a lot of his time in Paducah. He was owner of the Pirates, part owner of the Colonels, who eventually become the Pirates. He lived in Paducah in 1881, working for a distillery as a clerk. He saw his first baseball game in Paducah. And he owned part of a small team in Paducah in the 1880s. Moved to Louisville in 1888, and that's where he made his fortune, and then eventually buying a Major League Baseball team. He's responsible for the World Series, which it's called, does anybody know why it's called the World Series, by any chance? It's not a world thing. It's based on a newspaper, okay? It's based on, I believe, a New York newspaper. Yeah, and so that's why it's called the World Series, even though there's baseball in other places. He never forgot about Paducah. He would come often to visit Paducah. If you want to see, there's a really cool article in the Paducah Sun about Dreyfuss by Josh Roberts, if you ever have a chance. Really cool situation, but just since he owned the Pirates, I don't know if you noticed a lot of these players here played for the Pirates. So there's probably a connection there where he had a lot of scouts in this area to bring a lot of these players to the area. And I believe that the Pirates had a spring training in Dawson Springs, and so there's the connection there as well, so, which is no longer there, got flooded out.
Yeah, the city rebuilt it.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
saw
you
it.
can visit it.
Yeah, still pretty cool that Hannes Wagner fished not too far from where we live. I read the story about he was a big fisherman and he liked to fish in around Dawson Springs. Last thing I want to show you, these are just some Major League players that either played in and around our area through the Kitty League mostly. A lot of these I've already talked about today. A couple of them that stood out to me, Ray Sanders played on some World Championship Cardinal teams. Vern Stevens had a really good career as a major leaguer. He played in the Kitty League. So Bob Schultz had a really good career too. So a lot of history here in Paducah that a lot of people don't know about. So pretty cool stuff. Do you guys have any questions or anything that you'd like to ask or about the history of the Jackson Purchase and when it comes to baseball? I know that some of you, I'm sure, might not be baseball fans, and you might be bored to death, but yes.
Jim Hickman, I knew you.
Oh, yeah. So I researched Jim, and Jim isn't from the Jackson Purchase, he's from Tennessee. So he was from West Tennessee, not very far away. I believe Johnson City is where he was from. So he made a lot of trips to Paducah. Matter of fact, I used to work at a antique store downtown, and he would come in there quite often. If you know who Jim Hickman was, he played for the Cubs, really good career. Died just recently. Big hunter, he would come in a lot of times, I think to buy dogs and stuff, hunting dogs.
I noticed you didn't talk much about contemporary players, and that's, you can't talk about everything in half an hour. How many more recent players, for example, from Murray State or from some area high schools have really good programs?
So, Kirk Reeder is probably the most well-known that played at Murray, pitcher. That's the major one I know of. As far as locally, McCracken County has a couple, has one kid that is in the minor leagues with the Yankees. And then Tillman has a kid that's in the minor league, Fristow, the minor league with the Yankees as well. So I don't know how their career will progress, but there are some. And of course, the Haas twins played in the minor leagues. That's the most that I know, and I'm sure there are more.
Well, when you think about it, 1,000 people in the major leagues at any given time.
Oh, yeah.
And in the
The
minors,
minors.
probably 2,000 or 3,000.
No kidding. I mean, it's just, so many come and,
You mentioned the kitty league, and I just actually just broke down and what it looked like. Kitty
yeah, I have that book too. It's a good one, isn't it?
league. Yeah, and the names, I think the old time, the Mayfield Handsmaker.
Yeah. I have an old photo from when I worked at the antique store. They gave me this old photo from the 30s of a player in the Mayfield Pantsmakers uniform. Don't know who it is. I've tried for many, many, many years to figure out who it is. So, don't know. Know his name is Hank, and that's it.
I want to thank everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank Ben for a great job.
Thank you.
Really good.
I enjoyed it.